Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Middle East is on the top of the list of Russian President Vladimir Putin's regions of interest. He is involved in the Syrian civil war, but also in other challenges and ambitions in the Levant and beyond. To discuss Moscow's regional aspirations, we're joined here in the studio by Professor Zeev Hanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
Pleasure.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisin, who is an Israeli public diplomacy, security, and intelligence expert at IDC Herzliya.
Hi.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments vis-a-vis the Russian aspirations in this region.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Putin are going to meet in Moscow shortly, and Russian and Israeli military experts have been meeting in order to renew, restart, and reinforce the understandings between the two militaries regarding deconflicting over Syria because of the downing of the Russian Ilyushin in September, last September the 17th, by Syrian air defense forces. And as you said, the Middle East is at the top of the list of Putin's regional interests. However, it is derived of the overall strategy which Putin is trying to employ. And this strategy is, on the one hand, to advance Russia's interest, perhaps even hark back to the glory days of the Soviet Empire, which Putin personally regrets having disintegrated, but also to avoid confrontation, if possible, with the United States. And a few days ago, Putin met with his two Sergeys, the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. And he laid out for them his ideas. This also includes what is happening with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in Europe, which has elapsed, and other problems. He wants Russia, as far as possible, to compete, but also cooperate and not confront.
Professor Hanin?
I agree with what Amir said, but if you permit me to put it in a little bit more broad aspect of
Please.
Russian foreign policy at the moment. Kremlin does have a few challenges in their foreign policy. One is the situation with the Europeans. In principle, in Europe, they might have a bit, an impression in Moscow wars, at least that what we hear from there and what we read in the Russian newspapers and professional media, that in principle they have a problem. Europeans have a problem with the American administration, including the concern of the politics on the Russian side. And now it's going to be a meeting in Warsaw. And actually, Americans reach out to Europeans. Europe is not united and unified in concern of the changing politics and resuming sanctions or putting out sanctions over Russia. So from this point of view, it's a big minus. The second minus are Balkan states. Russian, just in a few weeks, recent weeks, they lost a couple of friends. Before that was Croatia, and then it's Greece, and now it's Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, of course. It's not necessarily important place, but one by one, starting with Venezuela, and then Europe, and then Balkan, they're losing their enclaves on influence. So what is left is actually to show the mighty. Syria is always a good place to show the mighty. On the other hand, I do agree with Amir when they say at the moment they're unable to do whatever they want.
Colonel Eisin?
I think that in Syria, they do whatever they want. I think that one of the aspects that for them, Syria is such a convenient location is it's one of the only places where they are the mighty, where they're the savior, where they're the ones who, as if, brought about that sense of peace. I could talk separately if there's actually any kind of end to this ongoing war there. But because of that, it's an element that they use not just in Syria, but throughout the region, not just in the region, but in the world. It is for them a ticket into the United States, into Europe, because the implications of a not steady, not safe Syria go way beyond it. And the ones who hold the ticket for something to be relatively a little bit more safe safe is actually in Russian hands. And I think that for them is at long last, they have something that really gives them an edge. The last point I'd make is on the aspect of Russia, Israel, Russia, Syria, Israel, and again, looking at the region. We have inside Israel a large Russian-speaking population. That's something that's different, but on a different level. But what we have even more so is a very strong present relationship between the leadership inside Israel and the leadership in the United States. And if you can use that area of Syria as a point of leverage, which is going to impact Syria and through that, impact Israel, and through that perhaps have Israel in some way impact the United States, why not use that leverage?
Mr. Oren, the Russians are expanded, however, not only to the Syrian arena, they have been meddling in different areas for their as part of their tactical maneuvering within their strategy, which has also brought them a lot of leverage, as everybody agrees on this panel. But we can see also that Iran, which has been used by the Russians on different arenas, is not the sole interest of Moscow. In particular, we can see that the director of the Russian Foreign Intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin, visited Saudi Arabia just recently, held meetings with his counterpart, also with Defense Minister, who is the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And even though they went out and beyond to keep the information from leaking outside of their meetings, there is a clear interest of Russia to cooperate with Saudi Arabia, the arch rival of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Tell us more about that.
Well, there are permanent interests, and of course, geography is destiny. But one should focus on the person of Vladimir Putin, because during the decade between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of Putin during the Yeltsin era, there was a so-called window of opportunity for Israel not only to have the Oslo process and peace with Jordan, but also to have serious talks with Syria. And had these talks been materialized before the Second Intifada, before the fall of Ehud Barak from power, and before Putin took over, and he is now the senior leader in the world. For the last 20 years running, he has been either prime minister or president of Russia. He really has no equal in the world today. And Putin's worldview is that the Russian Empire should have its legitimate interests and borders. However, he also learned the lessons of the 1980s, and he doesn't want to get into an expensive arms race. Russia's economy is not in a very good shape, substantially and in the view of the voters. And he must take care of his public opinion, even though he rules Russia.
Professor Hanin?
It is true that Russian infrastructure in a terrible situation, so they're unable to produce enough oil in order to cover all the expenses, especially in the situation when the prices are dropping down. It is really important for them to show, at least for their local population, but also to the worldwide, that they are almighty God, excuse me for that, for this expression, so he's able to do whatever he wants and is doing whatever he wants in Syria. But I think it's more impression rather than the reality. In principle, at the moment, they reached a sort of a dead end in the relations with Iran, that Iran now is planning to be the only patron of the Syrian regime. And from this point of view, Russians would like to get their share. They are ready to talk with them. And if it's correct that the pro-Russian and pro-Iranian forces are already in conflict in Syria, it also shows that it's not so, the situation is not so clear and is not so convenient for Moscow. Finally, we are talking about the last point. We are all the time are talking about Russian involvement in all sorts of the elections, trying to get a lobby to promote the Russian interest in various places. I'm not really sure that it is true. At least the 1 million, as you mentioned, Miri, 1 million strong Russian-speaking community in Israel is everything but a pro-Russian lobby. So at least that's what I
But
say.
may I ask you, Zeev,
Sure.
if you permit
Please.
me, are the Russians proactive or reactive? We see from the Ukraine almost 5 years ago. And then after their plane was shot down by a Turkish fighter, more involvement in Syria. And obviously they are advancing their interests, but is it part of a grand plan or just reacting to events?
Well, in principle, we know about the grand plan of Putin. It was absolutely openly presented in 2007 in the Munich conference. So his general idea was that all the suggestions, all the guarantees that were received by Yeltsin and Gorbachev in the previous times, that the whole sphere of the former Soviet Union, besides the Baltic states, will be ultimate property, let me put it this way, the area and influence of Russia, that NATO will not come close to the Russian borders, that Americans will not come to the Central Asia, that Iranians will be left for direct relations with Moscow, and Syria, at least Syria, forget about other Middle Eastern states, that at least Syria will be a client of Russia. According to them, I'm not even talking about all these guarantees for the Russian oil companies to be in Libya, to be in Iraq and all other places. Everything, according to Putin, what fails, promises. From this point, just to finish this point, from this point of view, he said that, I would say to Amir, that his policy was proactive. In practice, it's more reactive than proactive.
Colonel Eisin, Nikolai Paltushev, who is the Director General of the Defense Ministry and has been very active on Russia's behalf among Middle Eastern countries, just recently visited the United Arab Emirates for talks and Egypt as well. There is a expansionist concept right now within the Kremlin in order to reach to more areas and not necessarily bolster the investments of Russia in those areas, but to get more investments of those countries to bolster the Russian economy. What do you think about that development?
I think that Russia at this stage along the way is not just looking through the eyes of security in the way that they did in the past. And here in that sense, perhaps, I also disagree a bit with you because I do think that there's a lot about impression. I think that today that aspect of being an involved country in the world that has to do both with economy and not just with security is important, that it's mutual investments on both sides, that the Russians stepping back into Egypt after so many years down into the Gulf countries has to do with the fact that today the Middle East is open to different ideas. In a way, I could talk about the fact that the United States has stepped back. That opens opportunities not just for Russia, we see China inside, but certainly for Russia to step into places where once upon a time it was obvious that the United States would be. This has big implications for all the different relations within the Middle East. And again, I think that it is an opportunity, I don't like talking in those terms, I don't know if that's the right term, for Russia to step back. And I want to add one more point. When we're talking today about freedom in the world, when we're talking today about democracies, when we look at the maps that come up about that, Russia's not a democracy. None of the Middle East except for Israel is a democracy. And you look at the places where Russia is stepping into, the capabilities that they do have in today's day and age, through information, through impressions, through what people think about them, as opposed to the truth, because I always wonder what is the truth today for most people, means that they can regain a lot of capabilities that they lost over the years where it was clear that they didn't have economic capabilities, that their weapons weren't as good as other ones. Nowadays, they can show a different picture and people believe it.
Professor Hanin, your response?
Well, in principle, we have two political parties in Russia. One is the party of TV and the second party of internet. And many people who do not watch Russian federal channels and prefer internet, and it is not as closed as it is in China, they do not believe to all of the stories they are telling them. At least the results of the recent regional elections show that. If you will have a look on the opinion polls, still there are some opinion pollsters. They work in Russia. Well, we cannot say that it is so totalitarian movement regime that everything, image of everything. I agree, image is a lot, but not everything. And that is why Mr. Putin, who escaped from Mr. Netanyahu for so long time. At the end of the day, is interested to meet him in order to close or to come back to the previous ideas or previous understandings that he reached half a year or a year ago. On the other hand, I do agree with Miri when she's saying that at the moment all these forces or the step out from Syria are leaving space to Russia. And I believe that Mr. Putin is interested to use this opportunity.
Colonel Eisin?
I think that it's not just stepping out of Russia, it's stepping out of Syria, it's stepping out of all of the Middle East, and they're stepping into a broader Middle Eastern aspect. And sure, not everything is about impressions, but in today's day and age, in an information world, doesn't matter internet, not internet, depends what you're listening to on what you're going to hear. And I think that has a very strong impact.
But you agree that it's still pluralistic, even in this field?
Regardless of the alleged Russian involvement in American politics, and obviously we are living in the age of Trump, but these two shall pass either in 2020 or in 2024. The American mechanism, one may say, the apparatus, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, portray Russia as the United States' number one or two enemy, the other number one or two being China. Iran has been downgraded, Al-Qaeda and Daesh have been downgraded. The entire buildup of the American armed forces is aimed at the Russian and Chinese challenge 10 or 12 years from now. So in that sense, they are in competition everywhere. Now, because President Trump thinks otherwise, sometimes it is clouded when people hear various statements. But the way both countries, Russia and the United States, prepare themselves for the future in a triangle in which China is the third party, this is the major influence on the Middle East, as well as on Latin America. Venezuela was mentioned. Russia, of course, is on the other side of the fence, against the United States there. In Libya, it is against the United States. In many places, of course, the Ukraine or Europe in general. Obviously, the Russians are angry at this Warsaw Conference. Of all places, this used to be the Warsaw Pact. Of all places, the United States has decided to hold this conference in the Polish capital, while the Russians, of course, have been holding a similar one. And by the way, Russian foreign policy is also involved in the intra-Palestinian conflict. The Russians have been hosting the meetings between Fatah and...
That's totally symbolic, nothing more than that, that's for sure.
Of course.
Well, you're pretty much echoing what Colonel Eisin just stated with regard to the rivalry between the United States and Russia. And I'd like to ask you, Professor Hanin, do you believe that Moscow decided to enter or re-enter the Middle East after the Obama administration created the necessary vacuum to allow such a re-entrance? Was it as a strategy that puts in this equation of Russia, vice versa, the United States?
The answer is yes, but we should come back to Amir's question whether it was active or proactive. I believe that the Middle Eastern issue was among the first, but probably not the first one. For Mr. Putin, it was very important to put Russia in the position of superpower. Of course, he understood that he is unable to come back to the Soviet times. And never believed that it is possible. So what he was able to attract for Russia is Mr. Schultz's idea, the Russia as an energy superpower. In case they will be permitted to come closer to European consumption networks, in Moscow, a lot of people believe that in this case, he would much pay attention to what is going in Ukraine and Belarus, and even in the Middle East. But the answer was no. And from this point of view, his next step was proactive. He took from the shelf all different ideas and all different plans. Among them, there was an idea and plan. We might remember, everybody, and those who are watching us at the moment, they remember this famous expression: in case Ukraine is going to join NATO and European Union, Ukraine will do that without Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, New Russia. He said a few words about what are going to be in the Middle East. From this point of view, I would say that at the moment he keeps in mind the plan. I'm not sure he's able to fulfill it in full.
Colonel Eisin?
I feel that of all of the places, Syria is the place that Russia inherited, that Putin inherited, that's not a place where Putin stepped in and invented it. Au contraire, it was the Soviet base, it was the Soviet military, it was the Soviet know-how. He inherited that. But I think that what Syria enabled him in the Middle East and right now in the region, and in that sense to me, it's that with Israel and then versus the United States, is the capability to take something that was already there, enlarge it, win, give the perception of winning, and give him that added edge. And in that sense, I think that it's very central to the broader sense that it isn't just President Obama or President Trump, for that matter, stepping back and enabling them. I think that they wanted to step up and step in because it gave them that sense of victory.
Mr. Owen?
But having said that, the Russians know that Israel, of course, is a smaller country, but it doesn't pay to get into conflict with it. And friction is not good for either side. The Israelis have changed their behavior in Syria because of harsher and stricter measures taken by the Russians. And what the Israeli decision makers and intelligence professionals are trying to find out is whether there is some daylight between President Putin and the defense and foreign ministries. Because what the spokespersons of the defense ministry and the foreign ministry have announced was much more brutal than the moderate tone taken by Putin. So either it's a good cop, bad cop routine, or there is a real difference, and one should heed what the president says rather than the diplomats and the officers.
Professor Hanin?
Well, I would say that at the very beginning of his career, Russian president in the first cadence, he was more or less ready to be a president of one of the European countries, also very big, although, but still like a normal one, and the status of energy superpower will be enough for him. It was him who actually made a decision to step out of, to close the Russian bases in Vietnam, in Cuba, and Syria was going to be the next in line. But happened differently. And at the moment, he's in the situation which became a result of different trends and factors. And I do agree with the both colleagues, with Miri and Amir, when they say that at the moment it's unreversible. Russians are doing what they are doing, and he is unable to do anything different. To make an impression and to do everything in their power in order to ensure their clients and their satellites that they will never abandon them. And especially in the situation that they're unable to suggest anything from the economic point of view. Look what is going on with Venezuela. They have $17 billion of investment, which is not anybody is going to return, opposite to what is going on with the 50 billion Chinese investment there, which actually Chinese are going to get back. So from this point of view, I would say that Putin simply doesn't have any choice.
Colonel Eisin?
It's interesting because I really do think right now that Putin holds a lot more cards. I think that right now, because of his presence specifically in Syria in the Middle East, it gives him cards with Israel, that gives him cards with the United States. Because he's in Syria in the Middle East, it gives him cards with the other regional powers right now in that sense. And I think that it is a central enough point with Iran, with the region, that it also impacts both Europe and the United States. And in that sense, I feel that he holds more cards perhaps than what you've put here.
Oh, that's for sure.
I always go back at the end, though, to the late 1980s, early 1990s, and I say, but what about the economy? Perhaps it's both my American background, but looking at it, I always say at the end, if you don't have an economy, I don't think that the ideology will help them. And I'm wondering where that's going to take them on this adventure.
One very interesting point in the current Russian narrative is going back in history to World War II. You see that the Russians are emphasizing the Soviet part in the victory over Nazi Germany. And only a few days ago, in order to commemorate the anniversary of the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, they emphasized the promises made by the Americans and the British, Roosevelt and Churchill, to Stalin in order to justify the continued occupation of the Kuril Islands in Japan, so that they are not going to be blamed for being occupiers when they are asking Israel or others to relinquish occupied territories. And they want to keep the architecture of the post-World War. It's interesting that for the Russians, what was decided between the big three should still be the standard for today.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Professor Hanin, we'll start with you.
I would say that the Second World War is not the only narrative of the official Russian ideology. They have three narratives, a very peculiar combination. The narrative of the former Russian Empire, Tsarist regime, the communist power, that means equality to everybody and so on, and their narrative of the Russian democratic movement of the post-Soviet era. How they managed to combine all three, we see it here also in the Middle East.
Colonel Eisin?
I think that in the Middle East, Russia is one that we are going to be seeing more. I think that we need to be aware of it, and I'm not sure that this is good news for Israel.
Mr. Oren?
Because Russia has become a domestic political ball in the American game, and because the Republican Party is now considered more in cahoots with the current Israeli government, while the Democratic Party, which is against, of course, President Trump, is also a bit distancing itself from Israel. It will be interesting to see how the Russian-American-Israeli triangle takes shape in the post-Trump period.
And do you see the Russians expanding the hold from Syria to other countries in the region as well, considering the fact that they're also emerging bilateral agreements now with Turkey, with Egypt, and they're also discussing Sudan and elsewhere?
Yes, but their main interest is economy, energy. Of course, if they can gain some strategic foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean, so much the better.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, unfortunately, and this is a topic that we'll have to revisit in the near future. I'd like to thank Professor Hanin for being here today, Mr. Oren, and Colonel Eisin. Thank you so very much. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.